Now, the second candidate I looked at was Representative John Fleming, MD, out of Louisiana. He's the Republican. He's also a member of the House of Representatives, but for his speech, he's not necessarily looking to win an election, because this speech was back in June. He's talking to his committee about marijuana legislation, legalizing marijuana, and he's arguing against it. The title of his video is Marijuana Myths, and that really sums up what he's going to say. He's arguing that the arguments that the liberal base are using against the conservative base, he's arguing for the conservative standpoint. The arguments they're using are all perpetuated myths. They don't actually have basis in fact. And honestly, that premise of argument is where the flaw in his own argument comes in, because he's saying that his opponents don't have basis in fact. Well, he never actually ends up citing his sources, and honestly, when he's making that argument and not citing sources, just giving statistics without any backup to them, it makes his premise very questionable. It makes him as the speaker, as just the author of his own speech, a questionable source, and the ethos is just lacking there. Really, the primary flaw is when he uses some appeal to authority, and this is where that lack in ethos starts to come in, because the first thing he does in his video is actually to say he's been reading up on the works of Dr. Kevin Sabet, PhD. He cites Sabet, to start with, as an expert on the subject, referring to the whole field of marijuana and addiction to marijuana. First of all, we don't know that this is true. In this situation, though, we can probably assume that it's true. Just to start there, we haven't heard anything weird out of Fleming yet, so he's still a believable speaker. He is a representative in the House of Representatives, so we know he's official, so we can believe him on that point. But what he does next is he proceeds on to his speech. He gives this whole speech about how the ideas about marijuana and it's not being harmful or it's being helpful are all myths. He never comes back to his reading about Sabet. He never talks about any specific quotes, anything in particular he learned from the book. He just brings it up at the start as a way to prove that he knows what he's talking about. And really, it doesn't quite work, because he brings it up to show that he knows what he's talking about, but if he never comes back to it, it really makes you wonder, well, why did he bring it up in the first place? And at that point, it really starts to look badly on him. It looks like he's just pretending to know what he's talking about. He doesn't actually. And that gets repeated sort of in his second use of appeal to authority. He actually cites his own medical degree, which, to be honest, is a bad idea in most every situation as a rhetorical tool, because not only is it appeal to authority, it's also using personal experience, which has some inherent bias, and honestly, it's not very believable. His ethics, again, come into question here, because he is citing himself as a source. He doesn't give any sources after that. It makes him look a little questionable as far as his motives go, but also questionable as far as his own knowledge goes. Again, he's trying to prove his background knowledge on this without giving us any proof about his knowledge on this, which, not to use the word too many times, but which makes his knowledge look somewhat lacking. Specifically, his quote is, "Something which I've studied for years and wrote a book on in 2007. He's talking about brain maturation and how addiction plays into immature brains. He gives a statistic for it, sure. 25 and 30 years of age is the usual point where the brain matures. But the statistic itself, without anything to back it up, just contributes to that whole questionable speaker effect we have going here. And that's the primary issue, the whole lacking credibility, but still going to these authorities and using nothing specific from them. The secondary issue he has here, and he brings up other statistics without citing them, which is a problem in and of itself. But more importantly, what he does is he goes into using logical fallacy as some pseudo-evidence. He doesn't even give statistics for these ones. He just gives logic, which is flawed. And that honestly breaks all of the flow of his speech. It breaks the credibility again that he has. So one of his quotes is, "We hear the anecdotal stories, but that's how the myths come out. Is someone tells a story, and they tell someone else, and before you know it's been blown completely out of proportion, and this is a slippery slope fallacy." He's connecting one thing to another in what seems like a logical chain of events, but it's beyond what can be projected. He doesn't have any proof to back it up, so the logic is inherently flawed. He's also trying to, on a different note, he's trying to prove non-existence. Like, there isn't any evidence to prove that medical marijuana does have positive health effects. And trying to prove non-existence is fallacious in and of itself. It's infeasible. What he would have to do instead is bring up some statistic that directly states that there's not a correlation, that there's nothing that can allow medical marijuana to be beneficial to someone. And since he instead goes with there's no evidence to show that it's not, that implies that he doesn't actually have any evidence. There's no medical evidence to say that medical marijuana doesn't help you. It's just that there's no evidence that says medical marijuana doesn't help you either. So sort of a double fallacy there, really not proving his claim, but he's bringing it up anyway in an attempt to prove his claim. It's sort of the same effect Blumenauer had with those different pieces of logic that didn't quite fit together, that basically opened another avenue of attack for his opponents. Again, though, Fleming, his argument is a bit better than Blumenauer's, because here it's not really an avenue that the liberal base could exploit, so at least he gets a positive on that mark. He uses another logical fallacy when he says, if we have problems with tobacco and alcohol, why do we want to add a third problematic substance and create even more problems in our society? Now, to be honest, what's really sort of disappointing about this one is that he actually brings up a really good subject, and I think he could create a really strong argument out of this. But he doesn't cite any sources, he doesn't have any evidence, and as it is, this argument is drawing a false analogy between legalized tobacco and alcohol and legalized marijuana. As it stands, it's just flawed logic, it has no support, and again, it's opening another avenue. And honestly, it's just bad argumentation. He's using these pieces of logical fallacy as evidence when they're not even strong logic. So, between this and the appeal to authority issue, Fleming, his own knowledge and his own credibility really come into question within his whole speech. And what he needs to do first is source all of his statistics, or as many as he can, really, so that the audience will believe him, because that's the first step. Because if his audience doesn't believe him, he's not going to be able to get anywhere, because they'll distrust anything he says. Now, it's not that extreme, but he still has to worry about it. Now, what would really make his argument strong is building off that one issue of the issues with legalized tobacco and legalized alcohol, and be able to use evidence to prove that similar things would happen with marijuana. And I think that can make a really strong argument for the conservative standpoint. But since he doesn't, he's still left with this flimsy argument without sources, without really good logic behind it, and without credibility.